Chapter 651 Testing the Hydesgrain. Lilia attempted to protect herself the moment she noticed the black flames behind Jason's back in addition to his scheming smile. Using a vast majority of her primordial energy and mana, she inserted it into her strongest defensive technique which she exerted, the moment the black flames behind Jason's back erupted. The sudden heat, and the gravitational force that had done its work for the entire time. Meanwhile, Jason, who was hovering above Lilia, still clashing with her, was propelled towards the ground of the arena, where they crashed into. Only a moment later, an explosion occurred as cracks appeared on the ground where Lilia had been catapulted into and saw herself spit out blood. Just at that moment, Jason, who was completely unscathed, began to release dense mist that enveloped him and Lilia while the mist began to enlarge at a rapid pace. Being able to see clearly through the mist owing to his Emperor eyes, Jason let Byakuya vanish into the soul world, only to lash out with his empty hand, knocking out Lilia, who was still wriggling, trying to defeat Jason. In the end, Jason had to acknowledge that the cadets were somehow, both stronger and weaker than he had expected. Under normal circumstances, he would have an easier time against opponents with the same combat prowess as the cadets, but at the same time, their will to fight was a little bit low, decreasing the strength they utilized at a time. This was somewhat disappointing. Nevertheless, Jason was glad to have fought against the last three opponents that were all different, and unique in their own way, only to recall that Eren was still standing in the arena. Right, I just hit his doppelganger. It was interesting how the cultivation path of Spiral could be used, and Jason assumed that the doppelganger was just one of many tricks one could use to play with someone's mind. Eren's instinctive behavior had caused him to protect himself in the safest way, which was to create a doppelganger. Unfortunately, this used his entire stored spiritual force, preventing him from combining his spiritual force with mana, decreasing his strength tremendously. Thus, after having knocked out Lilia, Jason continued to release the icy mist, only to completely retract his Celestia aura and stigma, making himself almost invisible. Only his mana fluctuations that were also restricted to the extent at which he could barely release enough mist with the use of his ice affinity, were an indicator of where he was standing. Unfortunately, this forced Eren to rely on his mana perception, and not on his eyes, while Jason could see everything clearly. Trying to figure out how high the mana perception of the cadet Jennifer had chosen for him to fight was, Jason didn't even think of entering close combat with Eren for the time being. Instead, he waited for some time, trying to figure out a few things about the cadets, only to feel the eyes of someone on his back, eyes that were boring down into him with their anger. It was a human at the Ascendian stage, following the path of Marist, and his mana core seemed extremely interesting. Nevertheless, Jason couldn't be bothered about all of that because the anger targeted at him by this individual was not good. It felt like a special kind of hatred, reserved only for him. Did I kill his entire family, or is he enraged because it looks like I'm playing around? What else could I have done to him? In the end, he had no idea what he had done to the young man to incite his rage. Thus, Jason simply decided that said cadet had an anger management issue, which was the most likely reason in his opinion. Despite that, Jason couldn't help but think that it was better to finally end the battle, now that he had given Eren some time to find him. As such, he released everything at once, only to push himself towards Eren, and arrived in front of him a moment later. Because Eren couldn't see anything, he reacted a fraction of a second too late. He could barely perceive that Jason was exerting his movement technique, while circulating mana through his entire body, only for everything to be further enhanced owing to the fully unleashed stigma and aura. However, that was not all, as Jason had propelled himself towards Eren, the moment he pushed himself from the ground, accelerating the speed he could reach even more. Thus, the moment Jason appeared in front of Eren, it was already over for the cadet as he moved his hands towards Eren's abdomen to reveal a compressed, black flame that emerged within it. Shooting out one of Solaris' compressed flames, Jason saw Eren get flung more than a dozen meters away, who felt something burning through his abdomen. A moment later, this sensation dispersed as the compressed black flame dissipated into thin air. Only a moment later, he had appeared at the position Eren had landed, only to smile faintly as he apologized. "Sorry, I went a little bit over the top with the last attack." Eren looked at Jason as if he was a monster, only to shake his head. "He almost killed me, huh?" Accepting his defeat far more easily than the others, Eren stood up with a sigh before he replied. "No problem, thanks for not killing me, I guess." Jason wanted to say something, but before he could, he noticed that Eren had already turned around, leaving the arena and him behind. This caused him to smile dryly, only to turn around himself, where he saw that a few people had rushed to look after Lilia. His ice fog had dispersed the moment he had begun to utilize his fire affinity, and it was only then that Jason could see the appearance of the man glaring at him. It was a muscular human, with a height of more than 1.9 meters. His expression was full of scorn and hatred could be felt a mile away from him, which confused Jason, only to see his eyes flitting to Jennifer once in a while. However, Jennifer was only looking at Jason with a radiant smile that could have multiple meanings. After connecting the dots, Jason slowly began to understand what was going on. This guy is plain jealous that I get all of her attention. Doesn't look like he is confident with his own charm. Turning away, he could barely avoid the guy, whose name was Rex, from seeing his smile. Jason found it ridiculous to see that he had managed to irk someone at the Ascendian stage just because of Jennifer. However, somehow, he found it quite funny, and without even considering that Rex would attack him out of the blue, Jason approached Jennifer. Even if he would attract the rage of Rex, or even more cadets, he was eager to fight Jennifer. Ever since he had seen her, he had been trying to figure out how much of a difference it would be to fight someone with 3 awakened cultivation veins, and several more unique characteristics. One could say that Jennifer was his first opponent with multiple traits, or special characteristics such as being a halfling with repulsive elemental affinity seeds in her mana core, or her 3 cultivation veins. As such, his battle intent was noticeable, which caused Jennifer to smile from ear to ear as she said, "Rest until your mana is replenished, I want you to unleash your full potential when we fight." Chapter 652 Two Monsters. By Hydesgrain. Only 2 hours passed after Jennifer had advised him to rest a little bit. In that short period, she trained the other cadets, awaiting Jason to fully recuperate. She eyed him once in a while, and during one such stolen glance, he sensed someone's rage lingering around him. It was Rex, and Jason couldn't help but feel odd to be eyed as the love rival of someone at the Ascendian stage, without having done anything. Jennifer was beautiful, kind, and extremely interesting, but Jason had never really thought of the possibility of being in a relationship or falling in love. These things were something he had never had enough free time on his hands to figure out by himself because his time had always been scarce or the opportunity to even think about. As such, before he even thought about finding a partner, Jason wanted to figure out what his plans for the future were, and if it was even possible to fall in love without endangering his loved ones. He had already lost his masters and Scorpio, and without the necessary strength, falling in love was a luxury. He didn't think he could stomach the loss of someone as close as them again. However, at the same time, Jason didn't realize that emotions were harder to control than he could have ever thought. Love wasn't a choice, a decision that you made after weighing the pros and cons, it was something that just happened, even if the timing couldn't be worse. Unbeknownst to himself, his heart that had been closed for anyone except his soul bonds, was slowly opening up to this mysterious girl. After having lost those he had loved in the Great Argos War, his heart had been locked, but with a new chapter of his life manifesting the moment he emerged on Mana, its shackles were shaking. Thus, meeting Jennifer, someone who made him curious, was different than it had been during his puberty when he met someone who was beautiful or strong. It was also different from encountering someone during or immediately after the Great Argos War, it was just something new and something that made Jason comfortable. In the end, Jennifer was just like him, which was, in fact, the reason that made them comfortable with each other, and equally eager to fight each other right now. Thus, the moment Jason had fully recuperated, his mana entirely replenished, he got up from the ground where he had been cultivating to accelerate his mana replenishing process. Jennifer noticed this immediately, and halted her lessons, telling the other cadets to simply continue with whatever they were doing before ignoring him completely. This caused a commotion in the rows of cadets as they stared at Jennifer with a scheming smile. "Is it what I think it is?" one of the devas said with a devilish grimace on his face, only for Aeneas to blush as she said, "Maybe it is. Is she finally? That's something new." However, just as the female Eos said this, Rex, who was standing close to the Eos, growled, "Shut it, bitch." Releasing the intent to kill, Rex looked at them furiously, and the cadets who were gossiping about Jennifer's behavior with bright expressions on their faces quieted down. They hadn't noticed Rex, and could only apologize multiple times before they retreated as far as possible from him. Since their arrival to the cadet training camp that was hidden inside the hill on the barren lands, they had never witnessed Rex behaving like that. Under normal circumstances, he would just eye Jennifer from a distance, ignoring the others who stared at her, sometimes even lustfully. However, that had now changed. Rex couldn't even approach Jennifer as he had been doing occasionally during the last few years, because she had already rushed towards Jason the moment he had completely recuperated from the exhaustion of his earlier 2 fights. Even if Rex acknowledged that he had underestimated Jason, it didn't mean he would let a newbie take Jennifer away from him. Jason's combat prowess barely reached the Prisma stage, while his own was at the Ascendian stage. He might be older than Jennifer, but what was the difference of a few decades, if the lifespan of cultivators having reached the Prisma stage was well beyond 1,000 years? It was negligible, and Rex as well as everyone else was aware of this. Only talent and true strength mattered in the era of cultivation where the strong reigned and the weak were exploited and devoured. However, in order to release one's full potential and strength, one had to reach a certain age, a fact every living being knew very well. Even with unlimited talent, being very young, their inability to make full use of their potential made some prodigies succumb to their arrogance or to the fact that they had attracted the anger of someone they shouldn't have offended. This was exactly what was happening with Rex, whose entire being was filled with anger and jealousy, and poor Jason right now, who was completely ignorant to what he was doing. In the end, it was not his fault, and neither was Jennifer's for being interested in Jason, the specific things about him, and most importantly to fight him, even if she had to restrict her strength. Rather, it was Rex, whose uncontrollable emotions were causing chaos, as he watched Jason and Jennifer enter the combat ring. Both the young halflings were oblivious to the fact that Rex was eyeing them, trying to suppress his emotions, waiting for the finale. Jason eyed Jennifer intently, ignoring Rex's gaze that lingered on him. Rather, he focused on Jennifer and the words she had said earlier that he should unleash his full potential. He could do so, but initially, he was not sure if that was the best to do because his abyssal effect was still something he had no control over. The control over the chaos attribute in his body evaded him, and the mysterious being had returned to its slumber. At least, that was what Jason assumed, because even if he wanted to, there was no way for him to talk to it at all. Thus, he was reluctant to use his abyssal effect or the natural pressure he had comprehended to release because it was intertwined with his chaos attribute. However, this reluctance dispersed into thin air, the moment he noticed that Jennifer barely restricted her strength to the peak of the lick stage in all 3 cultivation bases only to release all 3 cultivation energies at once. They merged together, amplifying each other several times instead of deteriorating or negating each other as it would normally be the case for the 3 repulsive energies. Jason had seen this once from far away, several months ago when Jennifer had fought against the army of the Eos and Devere race in the Barren Lands while rescuing some humans from Mana. However, what he hadn't felt at that time was the overwhelming pressure that radiated from Jennifer, originating from the merging energies and a specific technique she was utilizing. With her aura, she enveloped the entire arena with its size of more than 100 meters in radius, causing the energies within her aura to vibrate wildly as if they were oppressed, and couldn't move at all. Seeing this through the Emperor eyes, Jason couldn't help but smile brightly as goosebumps appeared on his body. Why the hell did I even consider holding back? I need to be careful about not being beaten into a pulp. As such, Jason instinctively released his entire stigma, in addition to his Celestia aura, while instructing Artemis to occupy his mana core once again. Yet, instead of waiting, he immediately began the fusion process with Artemis that transformed his entire appearance in a matter of seconds. The spar had yet to start, but both Jennifer, with her restricted strength, and Jason, who was preparing to use every trick up his sleeves, were ready to give the best. Both smiled at each other, and they could feel the other's excitement to fight as the battle's countdown was initiated by one of the cadets who had been ordered to act as a referee. Just what kind of monsters are they? Chapter 653 All Out by Hydesgrain. Everyone watching the battle couldn't help but feel astonished about the extent at which Jennifer was releasing her strength. She might have restricted her cultivation base to the peak lick stage, but using all three cultivation energies at once, and intertwining them with each other was already more than enough to make her extremely strong. The pressure she released was overwhelming, but Jason could only smile as his entire being was transforming. Fusing with Artemis, he was ready to go all out, ignoring his earlier reluctance to use the abyssal effect. While white wings with silver strands spread out of his back, his hair changed into the same color, only for pitch black horns to protrude from his forehead. A second stigma manifested above his first one, while Jason's entire aura transformed from the pure, almost divine Celestia aura he normally had, into a wild aura that radiated cold and his sheer desire to fight to his heart's content. Jason looked like he had turned into a beast, only to release the pressure he had comprehended during the Liberation Tournament. Yet, instead of the chaos attribute that had been intertwined with the abyssal effect before, an icy cold was mixed into the pressure which Jason amplified by inserting mana into the pressure creation process. This resulted in the pressure exerted by him becoming more overbearing and denser, while his frosty aura enlarged, pushing back Jennifer's. At that moment, the battle was initiated with both sides already having unleashed one of their strongest forms. In the end, Jason was not sure whether Jennifer was giving her all or not, but he definitely was. Even if Petri's fusion increased his strength to a higher extent, the fact that he could use the frozen flame with a minuscule consumption of his mana, balanced out the small lack of strength. Furthermore, Artemis' bond with him was much firmer, allowing the fusion to last longer. Thus, Jason had chosen Artemis over Petri this time and summoned Byakuya, which he enveloped in a thick layer of freezing flames. Sky blue flames flickered around Byakuya, mirroring the color of his eyes after Jason accepted the entire fusion. Exerting the floating sky movement technique at the highest mastery, his speed more than doubled as he pushed his left foot from the ground. Small cracks appeared on the ground as he shot towards Jennifer, who had already manifested both of the swords he had seen a few months ago. Smiling brightly, Jennifer took a deep breath before she used all of her three cultivation energies to exert some sort of technique as she disappeared from Jason's sight. Even after his speed had more than doubled, he was almost unable to follow Jennifer's trajectory and caught off guard when she had already appeared, right next to him. She slashed out, knowing that her speed was something Jason couldn't reach his current cultivation stage. Yet, she was in for a surprise when she saw that Jason's eyes had already flitted towards the position at which she appeared a second later. Gleaming brightly, it was as if they were saying, "I got you." This caused Jennifer to feel a sudden sense of being overwhelmed, only to instinctively step away. A moment later, sky blue flames with the height of several meters erupted from the exact position Jennifer had been standing a moment before. Even if Jason was unable to cope with Jennifer's pace, the moment she slashed out, he was able to make his move as she had to slow down by a small margin. This was more than enough time for him to react as he was able to partially keep track of her movements. Jason was only capable of this because of his Emperor eyes into which he had released a large amount of mana, but that was perfectly fine because his sub-area was rattling due to the influx of surrounding mana that it absorbed at a rapid pace. Owing to the two stigmas fully released at the same time coupled with the sheer force radiated by the combination of aura and pressure Jason released independently, his mana replenishing pace accelerated to an extent he had never expected. Thus, the amount of mana he used to insert into his Emperor eyes was balanced out, leaving enough for Jason to manifest the frozen flame that drained a negligible amount of mana. Only through additional techniques that used mana was Jason slowly using up his mana as it replenished too fast otherwise. Nevertheless, his consumption was much lower than Jennifer's as she was using all three techniques at once, at a much higher extent, increasing her speed several times, which had allowed her to disappear from Jason's sight. Not sure if Jason's reaction was a fluke, Jennifer initiated another attack, but this time, she wouldn't back off if something were to happen. Telling this to herself, she would rather evade it and attack backhanded instead of retreating instinctively as before. Jason noticed a glint of determination in Jennifer's eyes that had only become firmer. As such, he knew that another clash, but only at a much higher altitude, was bound to occur. Thus, without any hesitation, he began to use up the mana inside his Emperor Eye's specific energy storage space, which was, in fact, the marble within his eyes. He hadn't used this storage space for months because he had other things to pay attention to. However, the amount of mana inside the small marble had reached a terrifying level, causing even Jason to be astonished. As long as he didn't use up the entire mana inside the marble, it would be fine, as he didn't want his sight to go blurry again. Yet, after thinking for a moment, he realized that this would only be a small sacrifice to win the fight of his life, against a being he was never ought to defeat, to begin with. Using some of the stored mana inside the marble, he slowly nurtured the Petrification Curse, the race-specific Weakening Curse, and the Abyssal Effect, trying to attain the highest potency of all three abilities. The sudden surge of mana within Jason caused Jennifer to act immediately. With the unique movement technique that required all three cultivation energies to be circulated through her body in a complex manner simultaneously, she disappeared once again from the sight of most cadets. At this moment, Jason's eyes moved at a slow, yet steady pace, following the rough path Jennifer was taking, only to sense that something had changed. She is using spiritual force to trick me. He realized a moment later as his Emperor Eyes sensed nothing but spiritual force within the body, whose pathway he was following. It was extremely terrifying to him that his eyes couldn't sense the obvious trap right away. However, even more horrible was that he couldn't find Jennifer, even after the doppelganger dispersed into thin air. Jason was able to sense her energy fluctuations, but oddly enough, they were spread over the entire arena, which caused him to frown. It's the aura, he could only think before he suddenly perceived that something had entered the range of his aura. Having enlarged it as much as possible without using too much mana, Jason was able to figure that Jennifer was in the air and behind him, diving towards his direction at a shocking pace. Realizing how fast Jennifer had suddenly become, Jason felt that he wouldn't be able to turn around fully, let alone evade the oncoming attack. Thus, he could already see how he was losing the fight right in front of his eyes, only to grit his teeth as he mumbled, "As if I would give up now." Chapter 654. That's cheating by Hydesgrain. Even if they were sometimes not seriously sparring, Jason was, in most cases, going all in, using his utmost efforts to win. Without using everything one had up to their sleeves, they would never know how strong they were, and if it might be a stupid idea to fight specific opponents. Furthermore, Jason hated losing, and even more so after not giving everything he could. With that thought in mind, Jason's will to continue fighting, and to defeat Jennifer increased substantially, intensifying the ferocious, wild aura he released. Merged with icy coldness, both his aura and the pressure he was releasing could be controlled freely, which allowed Jason to realize something he had never noticed before. Normally, the Celestia aura was neutral, and without an affinity, but now while being fused this had changed. Now, he could use the frozen flame and his ice affinity, without an insignificant mana consumption. This free usage included the entire range at which his aura and pressure were released. Thus, Jason let out a sudden roar that shook the surroundings as he released a terrifying cold, enveloping his entire body with a pale sky blue hue. His eyes with the exact same color were glowing brightly, but it was only when Jason's head was halfway turned, that Jennifer perceived this. She had almost reached him, and there was a gap of fewer than 20 meters between them. However, this distance suddenly felt as if it were kilometers to her as Jason's eyes brightened up. Out of nowhere, a gigantic glacier of ice emerged between the two of them, creating a huge ice wall that she had to cross in order to reach Jason. The glacier kept enlarging, pushing towards Jennifer. She was forced to slow herself down while slashing at the terrifyingly huge mass of ice in front of her. The cold radiating from the ice had unique freezing properties within it, and Jennifer realized that if she were to maintain contact with it using her bare hands, she would slowly start to freeze. And this included the time she would use the energy within her body to try expelling the freezing property. This didn't shock her, but it was astonishing as she was forced to use her own affinities to a certain degree, enlarging the darkness and light blade within her hand. Only then was she able to hack and slash at the glacier to reveal what ought to be behind it. Yet, what she saw was not Jason, but only a sculpture with his mana intertwined, causing her to look around in shock. Instinctively, Jennifer looked upwards, expecting that Jason would attack from the air, just like she did. However, instead of doing the obvious, she realized too late that Jason was not afraid of facing her head-on without the need to play tricks. Jason wouldn't say out loud because his entire childhood had forced him to use tricks to win against his opponents in fights he was not ought to win. In that period, Jason noticed that most people with a higher cultivation base, and even combat prowess, expected their opponents to surprise attack them from behind or at an unexpected angle. It was exactly because of this that Jason was using his utmost efforts to not do the obvious, as it was in most cases not even assumed. Because of that, the moment he had manifested the glacier, he had created a sculpture of himself, using a fraction of his mana, only to exert the floating sky movement technique to quickly move around the glacier. Thanks to this high speed, and Jennifer's distraction, he was able to appear below her only moments after she had destroyed the glacier. Appearing below her, Jason immediately pushed himself from the ground, trying to approach Jennifer, who was still in the air, without the need to use his wings. Ready to brandish Byakuya that was seemingly craving for blood, Jason used every ounce of strength within his body to push himself from the ground. It was exactly at that moment when Jennifer looked down, only to see him rushing straight towards her with an excited smile on his face. Unable to evade him as she was midair, in addition to the extremely high pace at which he was approaching her, Jennifer could only turn to the side, preventing the most dangerous outcome, while using her two swords to deflect the attack. However, instead of being worried about the clash, Jennifer was confident in her capabilities, which made her release both her holy and darkness affinity at the same time, enveloping her body tightly, increasing every aspect of her. Without her realizing, the two repulsively affinities that had been released were working together, amplifying Jennifer's mixture of three cultivation energies. Thus, her strength increased once again, giving Jason a hard time as their eyes locked. When this happened, a radiant smile emerged on Jason's face, which made Jennifer extremely uncomfortable. Had they not been fighting, this would have been different, but because they were currently in a fight, his smile worried her. Unfortunately, her worry was already too late, as Jason released the combined force of his petrification curse, the race-specific weakening curse that both hailed from Petri, and the abyssal effect, which was something Jason had for a long time. Combining the attack of his curses and abilities by using his sheer will to battle, he saw them amplify each other, working together as a single attack that infiltrated Jennifer's mind and entire being in an instant. Breaking through the protection mechanisms of her mind, which should have been extremely strong owing to her cultivating her mind in the path of spiral, the attack spread through Jennifer like a wildfire. Even though Jason wanted to emerge victoriously, he had instinctively restricted the power used into the abyssal effect, fearing that something might go wrong, once again. He didn't want another incident to happen, as the last one had already been shocking enough. Nevertheless, the sheer power behind his fully empowered curses, amplified by the abyssal effect, were strong enough to hit Jennifer to the core. First, she stiffened, only to realize that her entire body had undergone a weakening before her mind blanked out for a moment as she was thrown into an endless darkness. Owing to her cultivation in the path of spiral and Jennifer's unrestricted cultivation base at the peak of the Prisma stage, her mind was protected in multiple layers. As such, She was only inside the endless darkness for less than a quarter of a second. Despite that, Jennifer felt like dozens of years had passed, barely realizing that she was still fighting with Jason, the moment he had appeared right in front of her. Yet, even the millisecond of imprisonment in the endless darkness made her feel thoroughly confused, which caused her to instinctively release the restriction on her cultivation base. Thus, before Jason was even able to brandish Byakhor, Jennifer accidentally unleashed the entire power of a being with 3 vessels at the peak of the Prisma stage, targeting him for a quarter of a second. The pressure around him increased, and only a moment later, he was flung back to the ground where he came from. However, as opposed to earlier, his speed increased several times as he crashed right into the battle arena, which caused him to spit out blood as his sight blurred. "That's cheating," he barely voiced out, only for Jennifer to regain her senses as she looked at Jason in astonishment. Huh, what? Chapter 655 Recognition by Hydesgrain. In the beginning, Jennifer didn't even realize that she had released the restriction on her strength. It was only when she saw that Jason was unable to get out of the depths of the arena he had been bashed into, let alone move, that she understood what had happened. This caused her to quickly retract the 3 fused cultivation energies as she dived towards the ground, to help Jason get up. A worried expression appeared on her face, showing Jason that she hadn't done it intentionally. Thus, he didn't say anything, and realized that Artemis fusion had been severed. Because of that, his strength receded, just like his appearance that returned to his usual self. His entire body was sore, and he felt as if he wouldn't be able to move around properly for the next few hours. In order to avoid this, he let Solaris enter his mana core, before manifesting its flames inside his body, soothing the pain and soreness within him. This allowed Jason to turn towards his right side, where he found Byakhor. Releasing a faint thread of mana, he enveloped Byakhor with it, allowing his soul weapon to return to the soul world. Despite having mana within his mana core, the fight had evidently ended, even if it was different than both Jason and Jennifer could have hoped for. Nevertheless, it had been exciting, and Jason couldn't help but smile, ignoring the pain within his body as he said, "That was fun and extremely helpful. Let's spar more often from now on." Jennifer had been worried that she hurt him, but seeing that he was alright, she couldn't help but return him a smile too as she nodded her head. "It's really interesting to fight you. Let's definitely repeat it." With that agreement, both of them decided to fight more often against each other, thereby increasing their combat experience, combat awareness, polishing their instincts, reflexes, and most importantly, the bond that had just been established between the 2 of them. The easiest way to get to know someone else was to fight them, because one would get to know how others behaved, how they fought, and what kind of personality one had according to the subtle movements and specific traits one perceived during a fight. While it was easy to deceive someone under normal circumstances, acting sincere while, in reality, being someone else than one showed, this was something completely different during a fight. It was not difficult to perceive if someone was holding back or forcefully adjusting their combat style in order to please others, or even to do things one would never do under normal circumstances. However, by using his whole capabilities, Jason had revealed everything in front of Jennifer, which allowed her to understand what type of individual the young halfling in front of her was. What she comprehended about Jason was by no means bad, rather, it made him even more interesting than he had initially been to Jennifer. Even if Jason couldn't truly figure out Jennifer because she had restricted her strength, including specific techniques, the full capabilities of her affinities and other special traits she might have, he was still able to roughly gauge what kind of a person she was. And this was satisfying enough to make him think that Jennifer was a strong yet kind woman, who he could trust to a certain extent. She was interesting, and by fighting her more often, it should be possible for him to get to know her better, which was something he wanted to do. It was odd, but both felt that a bond had been created between the 2 of them during the fight, and both interpreted the bond in the same way. They thought it was a simple bond of friendship and camaraderie. Little did they know that they were simply unable to realize its true meaning. While Jason's sore body was slowly recuperating, the process accelerated owing to Solaris' unique characteristics. Jennifer couldn't help but think that Jason was extremely powerful, and that it wouldn't take long for him to reach her combat prowess. He will be much stronger than I am right now when he reaches my age, she thought, realizing that Jason was already that strong when he had barely been on Mana for a few months. In the end, Jason was more than 5 years younger than Jennifer, and despite her requiring thrice the time and energy to cultivate, she had reached the peak of the Prisma stage in all 3 paths in her mid-20s. This was shocking enough, but considering that Jason, who was only cultivating in 1 path, was likely to be stronger than that at this age, it was even scarier than Jennifer could imagine. I wonder from which races he hails. Simple questions like this were just the beginning of the pile of doubts that further ignited Jennifer's curiosity in Jason. He was already deep in thought, thinking about the fight against Jennifer, and what he could have done better. Even if I don't have a martial art technique, the floating sky technique and my knowledge of the most basic techniques should be enough, or should I try to focus on learning a neutral martial art technique with which I can use Byakuya and all kinds of affinities? In the end, a martial art technique improved one's combat prowess by leaps and bounds. However, at the same time, it restricted one in the versatility with which said technique could be used, until one had a perfect mastery allowing the user to change the necessary movement sequence at will. It was even possible to make specific techniques stronger by changing the order of movements, but for that, one would have to know the technique like the back of their hand. In the end, this was not something Jason was fond of because most techniques he could obtain were, at most, at the Terra grade, which might sound extremely strong in comparison to fighting without a specific technique. Yet, at the same time, his goals were already too high, and he would rather learn a Heaven's grade technique than any other. It would make sense to use his utmost efforts to learn such a technique as if he had been born with its knowledge. While being deep in thought, he also tried to recall how he had used the wild, ferocious aura as well as the pressure in combination with his ice affinity, as it was something he hadn't been able to pull off before. This was interesting and gave him more than enough information and knowledge he had to process. If I merge the pressure into my aura just like Jennifer, it should become even more terrifying, right? He thought, only to notice that Jennifer was speaking to him. Jason, Jason. Shaking his head, he was brought out of his meditative thinking, as he looked straight into Jennifer's silver eyes whose highlights were the crimson outlined pupils. Yes. We should leave the arena, so as to get it repaired and let the other cadets continue training. Nodding his head, Jason just recalled that there had been others except them, which made him take a look around. The wrath in Rex's eyes was still apparent, but there was also something else gleaming in his eyes, which made Jason even more uncomfortable. Does he really consider me as a rival? He wondered while trying to make sense of the weird feeling he got. It was almost as if Rex had acknowledged him as a rival in multiple fields, only for Jason to be oblivious to what was going on. Even if he was uncomfortable with that, Jason couldn't help but think that this might as well turn into something good. As long as Rex didn't kill him, everything would be fine, and from what he understood, the cadet at the Ascendian stage was even someone with an extremely high combat experience. As such, it might as well help him to spar against Rex, under the condition that he survived. I should become a little bit stronger first. My combat prowess needs to reach the Prisma stage as quickly as possible. Right now, even if Jason didn't know about it, the need to become stronger at the fastest possible pace was even more urgent than anyone could ever expect. Chapter 656 Perfectionated by Hydesgrain. Now that Jason had fought against Jennifer with his entire combat prowess, he knew what he had to improve on first. He hadn't used the Chaos attribute while fighting, but that was because his control over it was simply non-existent. Using something one couldn't control was not what Jason liked to do, as it might end up in a disaster under any given circumstances. As such, adapting to the subtle released Chaos attribute inside his body had become an important priority for Jason. Other than that, he wanted to perfectionate his mastery over the floating sky movement technique just like the 3 auxiliary techniques he had learned. This would require lots of his time, and dividing his daily schedule in proper segments had now become important. Using 4 days of the week for blacksmithing, concocting, and inscribing runes, Jason spent the remaining 3 days improving his combat prowess, whether it was sparring with other cadets or trying to comprehend something. At the same time, he set aside several hours of each day to cultivate at a rapid pace, using the best suitable places in the surroundings to make use of Jason's high mana absorption. He could further amplify this by unleashing his Stigma and Celestia aura in an unrestrained manner. It was necessary for Jason to purchase certain things in order to produce goods with his auxiliary occupations, which he would sell to gain a huge fortune and utilize it in several ways. First of all, he felt the need for improving the mana and primordial energy supply within his soul world. Through this, his soul bonds could cultivate without leaving the safest place he knew of. Jason also wanted to try looking for certain martial art techniques, better cultivation and body refinement techniques that would allow him to become much stronger in a relatively shorter period of time. Unfortunately, every single technique was extremely expensive, and the more interesting the technique he came across was, the more unique, rare, and thus more expensive it was priced. Even if Jason were to save up all the funds he would earn through an entire year, he was not sure how close he would come to even one of the unique techniques' price. Thus, he had tweaked his strategy early on, knowing that the auction house of Lanrose City was something one had to make use of. Exploiting the need for not only strong but also different techniques, Jason could tell that most of the manuals that were simply lying inside his spatial ring and collecting dust were useful to achieve this. Nevertheless, he couldn't sell all techniques at once, and had to make use of the high demand, low supply effect that led to skyrocketing the price for Terra Intermediate and Terra Advanced manuals he possessed. In the end, Jason was not interested enough in the auction house to be present every single time he auctioned a Terra Intermediate manual. Rather, he scheduled all the Terra Intermediate manuals to be sold once every day for the first 2 weeks, only to slowly increase the gap in time in which they were sold. Thus, spanning over more than 4 months, the vast majority of manuals would be sold, leaving him with a total of 10 Terra Advanced techniques which he would sell at the auction house's biannual event auction. Jason assumed that he would be able to make the biggest fortune out of his advanced manuals by auctioning them off at the biannual event, instead of the common auction that was held every single day. With that thought in mind, he had already ordered someone to evaluate it, and help him figure out whether the techniques were suitable to be sold at that event or not. To his dismay, there were only 3 techniques that were eligible to be auctioned off at the semi-annual event. This was not what Jason had expected, but after giving it some more thought he realized that the situation might turn out to be better than expected. With all techniques being sold off in 4 months' time, the fortune he should have acquired was supposed to reach the requirement to purchase one good technique. At least he hoped so, because there was no way that he would continue to use Terra Advanced ranked techniques, as it was the highest he had, while even the cadets of the Tritons organization seemed to be using stronger techniques. Jennifer had offered to ask Luna, her master, about getting him a technique on his behalf, but without having ever done something for Lanrose City Lord, Jason felt that it was wrong to simply ask for a strong technique. However, this was mainly because he could tell that his greed would overwhelm him. As such, he would probably ask for a heaven-ranked technique, which was his final goal to attain during the next few months. With everything prepared, Jason used the next 4 months to reach his highest possible combat prowess without neglecting a single trait of his, improving his overall capabilities tremendously. Being considered highly talented in the means of cultivation, the technique he utilized may only be at the Terra Intermediate rank, but that was not important. If Jason were to cultivate while being seated, fully focused on the mana absorption and liquefying process, creating more than 24 mana drops was no problem. This was something Jason made use of, and he cultivated without holding back. This increased his combat prowess by sparring and comprehending important things while improving knowledge and proficiency in the 3 auxiliary occupations. After 4 months, he had reached the perfect mastery of the floating sky movement technique, allowing Jason to move around at a rapid pace without consuming too much mana. At the same time, his own cultivation speed progressed as well as that of his soul bonds. He cultivated for several hours, every single day without fail, and because of that, in a matter of 4 months, he reached the peak of the 5th lick stage. Now he had more than 4,700 liquefied drops of mana inside his mana core. Adding the factor that he required thrice the amount of mana than one would usually require to liquefy a single mana drop, Jason was more than satisfied with this outcome. Meanwhile, Artemis entered the mid-4th lick stage, but Petri was even stronger than her as he entered the early 7th lick stage. However, that was not everything Petri had achieved. He had liquefied a total of 3 more life force drops, increasing the total number of life force drops to 7, which enhanced Petri's physical strength further, only for Jason's to be amplified too. Solaris, on the other hand, was not improving by leaps and bounds as he and his soulbonds were. Nevertheless, it had already reached the Prisma stage, in which it was more difficult to improve the cultivation base by a large margin, using only 4 months. Thus, Jason did not bother much about the invisible progress Solaris had. Rather than focusing on the negative points, he was more interested in the pace at which Solaris was gathering mana and soul energy to continue advancing. Even if Jason was satisfied with his own cultivation progress and that of his soulbonds too, there was something else that made him much happier. Finally, after a total of 4 months, he was able to tell the cultivation base of a being that had cultivated in the path of Prior, almost perfectly. Chapter 657 Auction by Hydesgrain. Using his Emperor eyes to tell the difference of the degree to which a prior individual had refined their body and cells was extremely difficult. Nevertheless, Jason had been able to achieve this, while procuring and digesting all kinds of information from the cadets he had fought during the last 4 months. Owing to that, not only his combat experience increased but also his knowledge about the 3 cultivation paths, the special traits each of the paths had, and their respective shortcomings. In the end, it was not correct to speak about weaknesses of a path, and rather than the said shortcomings it was more about the uniqueness of each path's advantage that made it difficult for some to properly use it. With that in mind, Jason was sure that certain cadets would have been better off if they had awakened a different cultivation vein. Unfortunately, fate dealt an upper hand and said cadets had to adjust themselves to the given situation. They might not even know that their talent was seemingly wasted with the cultivation path they were fated to follow, and Jason couldn't help but think that it was better that way. Otherwise, it might as well lead to a wound in their heart, preventing them from being fully focused on cultivating until both the injury and mentality would be fully tended to. Jason also thought that his own situation might be similar, even if he was not exactly sure about that. If he had been fated to awaken a different cultivation vein, would this have changed something for him or not? Questions and doubts swirled through his mind once in a while, and they distracted him more from what happened in his surroundings than anything else. Thus, only now did he notice that it was almost time for the biannual auction event, as 4 months had already passed, while the fortune he had acquired during the last few months had increased substantially. Jason had lost the count of Ascendian-ranked cultivation resources he had obtained because he had tested giving mana stones of the same rank to Artemis. With this, he wanted to accelerate her cultivation speed, which worked perfectly fine, had they not encountered the problem wherein Artemis almost exploded owing to the tremendous mass of mana that was sealed within the mana stone at the lowest quality. Nevertheless, it worked, and except for the feeling of being torn apart, Artemis liked the fact that she could hasten up her cultivation speed, doubling it. If her body would be able to fully cope with the Ascendian rank mana stone, her normal cultivation speed might even quadruple. Unfortunately, this was easier said than done, and by feeding Artemis with mana stones at the Prisma rank, Jason could see the progress in which her cultivation speed was already doubling. This seemed to be her current limit, but Jason was already extremely fond of that, thinking that she was truly his most talented soulbond. Even if she was the weakest as of now, this wouldn't be the case forever, even less after Artemis would finally undergo her second evolution. Jason was not sure what exactly Artemis' racial limit was because even as a snowflake owl she could easily break through her racial limit. Despite that, Jason felt like Artemis had already reached this form's racial limit, which made it more difficult for him to believe that she wouldn't evolve soon. She was ready to evolve too, and both Jason and Artemis believed that she was only missing a small push, which could probably be done with an item she required. Hence, Jason had started to research all kinds of peak prisma, and normal Ascendian stage items that had an ice attribute or unique characteristics with which Artemis might be able to initiate her evolution. In the end, finding a suitable item was easier said than done because Jason didn't think that most of the ingredients and materials which he found were what he was looking for. Something or the other was always missing, but instead of being discouraged by this, Jason felt that the more exotic the item he was looking for was, the better. The rarer an item, the better its effect. This was something Jason had realized since he was young, and oddly enough, he was still confident to find what he was looking for soon, even if the item he required was extremely rare. Jason hoped that the auction house would become the treasure trove where his search would finally come to an end. However, at the same time, this made him worry that he might not have enough funds to purchase an item if he were to find what Artemis required. Even if purchasing said items might require every single mana crystal he had, Jason would gladly use them because it would benefit him far more than a rare technique for the same price. Finding a specific item had much lower chances than a suitable manual for him to use, thus, he knew his priorities. What came in as a pleasant surprise was the information that Jennifer was attending the bi-annual auction too. She was going there in place of the City Lord to purchase specific things they required, and Jason didn't hesitate to ask her if she wanted to accompany him. During the last few months, their bond had strengthened, and they felt comfortable around each other, even if they didn't say anything. The sole fact that they were together was enough to make them be at ease, which was something the cadets Jennifer was training had noticed too. Even Rex couldn't help but realize that his chances were dwindling because the attitude with which Jennifer interacted with him was worlds apart from how she treated Jason. He found it ridiculous and it made him furious, but without the authority to lecture Jason, let alone the fact that he didn't have enough strength to make Jennifer his, Rex shut himself off from worldly matters. Instead, he started to cultivate as if he was possessed. Through this, he wanted to become stronger at a rapid pace, in order to defeat Jennifer at least once, while clearly showing that he was much better than Jason. One could say that it was his last resort, but the desperate attempt made everything only worse for him because he didn't intervene in the progression of Jennifer and Jason's bond. Thus, the two of them went together to the bi-annual auction. In front of the auction house, they were able to see a huge crowd of people that wanted to enter the large entrance of the building in order to spectate the auction and bid on it. Jason had already estimated that they would have to queue up and wait for several hours, only to see Jennifer smiling brightly at him as she took out 2 golden tickets with 4 big written letters on it. VVIP. This caused Jason to only stare at Jennifer for a moment while she dragged him along, ignoring the hesitance in his eyes. Why are you suddenly so hesitant? I obviously would take you with me. Who else am I going to the auction with? Teasing him, she smiled, only to pass by the queue of people, all of whom looked at Jennifer for a moment, only to turn back as they realized that it was the City Lord's disciple. However, just a moment later, the gaze returned to Jennifer and noticed the young man, who she was dragging along with her. Jennifer's appearance was already superior, even after her cover-up. Yet, Jason's broad body that could be described to be athletic, with a surplus of muscles, gave him the vibe of someone who cultivated in the path of Prior. To top it all, his flawless facial features and charming golden eyes made him look exotic. Thus, he was even more unique than Jennifer in the onlookers' opinion. Despite giving off the vibe of cultivating in the path of Prior, Jason was obviously cultivating with mana, which was noticeable through his mana fluctuations, but that was not important right now. The City Lord was known for loathing men, which was the reason for everyone to believe that the same applied to everyone else under her banner. Evidently, this was not the case, otherwise, Jennifer wouldn't smile brightly while pulling Jason along, only to disappear from the queued-up people's sight, the moment they entered the auction house with the VVIP tickets. If the sight of Jason, right next to Jennifer, was already shocking to these citizens, how would they react, if the news that he lived in the city lord's abode, freeloading on the city lord's kindness, reached them. Chapter 658 Path of Wealth by Hydesgrain. Initially, Jason had been under the impression that the entire city would already know about his existence and the fact that he lived in the city lord's manor. However, to his astonishment, the merchants' appraisers he had encountered during the last few months were more professional than he'd thought. They had not disclosed any of his information to others. They might have been astonished that a man lives in the city lord's abode, where men were forbidden and severely punished under normal means, but keeping their public image clean was more important. It was simply not worth revealing Jason's information in exchange for tarnishing their reputation and incurring Luna's wrath. When Jason entered the auction house for the second time to hand out all manuals he had wanted to schedule to be auctioned off, he immediately realized how much the interior had changed. From looking relatively plain, Jason could now see all kinds of items that were exhibited behind glass showcases. These were a few items that were auctioned off, and the 3 Terra advanced techniques that were considered unique were amongst them. Their price was extremely high, to begin with, in Jason's opinion, and he couldn't help but feel glad about having made a deal with the auction house the first time he had entered it. Even if it had been a little bit problematic, Jason was able to pull off a little trick. He had only 3 rare cultivation techniques to sell, however, based on their rarity, they would be overly expensive, which made it impossible for ordinary citizens or small-income families to purchase them. As such, Jason had simply told the manager who had coincidentally appraised his items, that it might be a good idea to please the smaller or medium-sized income families during the bi-annual auction event too. Thus, it would be good to use the remaining 7 manuals to start off the auction as some sort of an appetizer and bring forth the main course immediately afterward. Even if the manager knew what Jason was trying to pull off, he thought that it was a good idea, considering that the remaining 7 manuals were still quite rare, just barely not within the standards of the bi-annual auction event. Considering the idea Jason had proposed, the manager had called the city lord to seek her permission. She was the one governing everything and in charge of the given rules after all. Luna had accepted Jason's proposal without hesitation because the manuals were still rare, just barely below the standards. But that was not the main reason for her grant permission. Rather, it was the fact that Jason was the one to have made this proposal. In the end, she may be in charge of the auction house, but it didn't necessarily belong to her. A neutral organization had wanted to build the auction house, and in exchange for her approval, conferred her with the bare minimum rights to change the rules to a certain extent. Because of that, Jason was able to get rid of all his manuals, only to see that the price for the non-exotic manuals was already priced at 5 large-sized cultivation stones at the Ascendian rank. A single medium-sized cultivation stone at the Ascendian rank was the price at which merchants purchased the Terra Intermediate manuals, only to sell them for at least 10 times that price once again. While a single medium-sized cultivation stone had 50 times the amount of energy sealed within itself than a small-sized cultivation stone, the same difference applied to large and medium-sized cultivation stones. They had 50 times the amount of energy sealed within, coupled with an even higher mana purity. Thus, even a single large-sized cultivation stone was extremely valuable, and each of the 7 Terra advanced techniques was priced at 5 large-sized cultivation stones. Merchants would sell them for at least 15 to 22, or maybe even at a higher price, which made Jason realize that the fortune he had procured from his relentless work and selling of Terra Intermediate technique was less useful than expected. Fortunately, his cultivation manuals were unique in the sense that they didn't exist on mana. This made every single technique he sold much more expensive than its usual price, which was now, at the latest, noticeably higher. While he had procured around 7 large-sized stones at the Ascendian rank, if he converted everything he had earned, this fortune would be earned several times today with the sale of each technique. This caused Jason's mood to brighten up further, even if he would lose 20% of his profit to the auction house as its fee. Their cut would eat a sizable chunk of his income, but Jason assumed that he would earn much more from the auction house than the merchant would give him. Thus, he began to ponder if it was possible for him to copy a technique to earn an even higher fortune. Unfortunately, this was not as easy as it had been on Argos, with the Neutral Body Refinement Manual or the translations of other manuals, because copying didn't work that way. In order to properly copy a technique, he had to be able to use it at the perfect mastery, giving him the chance to imprint his knowledge directly onto the technique. In the end, this would mean that he had to learn all techniques at the perfect mastery before copying them, which would require a great deal of effort. Maybe I should make a few copies of the floating sky movement techniques and stockpile it so as to use them when I am in dire need of some funds. Handing out the technique he was using was not necessarily the best he could do, because others might be able to figure out its weak points after reading the manual. As such, he would only copy and sell the floating sky movement technique if he was in a desperate need of funds. With that in mind, Jason was able to retain his calm as he began to look at the other exhibited items, trying to evaluate what made them special without reading the description. This was something he had always wanted to perfect, the utilization of his Emperor eyes in order to use them in the wilderness without the need to know every single herb, tree, plant, or, and other things that might be valuable, or possibly even dangerous. If he were to be able to do that, many possible issues could be prevented while not a single opportunity would slip through his hands. With his mind fully occupied in trying to appraise items with his Emperor eyes, Jason didn't even realize that he was subconsciously walking next to Jennifer, who stared at him, trying to figure out what exactly he was doing. Jason had inserted a tremendous amount of mana into his eyes, and without knowing what exactly his special trait was, Jennifer could only think that he was trying to perceive the energy fluctuations from the items that had been exhibited. Just at this moment, Jason stiffened as he halted in his tracks, looking like he had been petrified, which made Jennifer squint her eyes, wondering what happened. What she didn't know was that Jason's soul world had begun to shake violently out of nowhere, causing him to freeze in his tracks, as Artemis screamed out from the depth of his soul world. She released her excitement, transmitting it to Jason the moment she felt the aura of a specific item that was exhibited. Is that item that she needs to evolve, really, just why? Chapter 659, Frozen Lunarium. By Hydesgrain. The exhibited item that attracted Artemis' attention looked ordinary, but through the Emperor eyes, Jason was able to see the truth behind the seemingly ordinary appearance. In the end, it was just a head-sized orb that was white, half-transparent with a silverish, liquefied core inside. Taking a look at the name and description, Jason figured out that the orb was called Frozen Lunarium, an item at the Ascendian rank that could be used to enhance one's ice affinity if channeled through the orb. For people that had an ice affinity, and didn't use any close-range weapons, but relied on a wand, this would come in handy and was extremely strong. However, considering that the Devas couldn't awaken an ice affinity, while the humans on Mana didn't even have a mana core, Jason could tell that its price wouldn't be too high. Only a small number of Eos should be able to use the orb in front of him. Amongst that little group, even less would use a wand, or weapons that solely focused on increasing their ice affinity. Because of that, Jason was confident that he could purchase the Frozen Lunarium, only to see that its price was 10 large-sized cultivation stones at the Ascendian rank. Other than that, there was the possibility to purchase it directly for 100 large-sized Ascendian rank cultivation stones, which caused Jason to halt in his tracks. Artemis definitely needs this to evolve, otherwise, she wouldn't react as she did. The instant purchase price was exorbitant for him, but the starting price was already high too. This made Jason believe that the Frozen Lunarium's use was more than just the effects he had read about. Because of this, Jason turned to Jennifer, who was still looking at him as he asked, "Is this ingredient even useful for anyone here? The description is not really special, let alone of any use to the 3 races that live in Lanro." Jennifer noticed that Jason was interested in the Frozen Lunarium, which made her believe that he had sensed something about it that might help his ice affinity grow. It could also be something similar, but that was not important. If he perceived an opportunity, it would be something good, and thus she averted her gaze to the Frozen Lunarium to take a look at its price before she commented. Frozen lunarium has many uses. Not only does it have the obvious effect of strengthening the output of the ice affinity once channeled through it, but in most cases, it's used differently for potions. Said potions are extremely difficult to concoct, and if I remember correctly, two of the most important potions are the rejuvenalizing potion and the frozen disease potion. The rejuvenalizing potion is just what its name suggests, while the frozen disease potion freezes all kinds of disease, even the most lethal ones, destroying them without leaving behind any lingering traces of harmful after-effects to the body. In the end, these potions require other items that are even more difficult to procure, but the frozen lunarium is still one of the more expensive ingredients. As such, if you really need it, just purchase the frozen lunarium instantly. It might seem more expensive at the first glance, but there are two families, one of the Devere and one of the Eos race, that require the frozen lunarium for their own plans. Because of that, the price will definitely cross 100 large-sized Ascendian rank cultivation stones. Jason had listened intently, and after Jennifer finished her short speech, he looked at the frozen lunarium for a moment before he pondered on the ways he could utilize to procure the necessary funds. Right now, he was still too poor, and only after the sale of 10 manuals would his fortune be at an acceptable degree to let him have the luxury of buying something. However, with that in mind, he knew that his fortune wouldn't be enough to purchase another treasure from the biannual auction. Weighing the choices at hand, Jason pondered about it for a moment. Artemis was not exactly helpful because she was voicing out her eagerness to devour the frozen lunarium, like a child nagging for a toy. She was even starting to demand it, which caused Jason to frown lightly, only to make up his mind as he transmitted his thoughts to Artemis. If you don't evolve after this, I will restrict our communication channel, Artemis. Then, you won't be able to manipulate me like now, because I very well know that you're doing this intentionally. A moment later, Jason turned towards Jennifer, as he shamelessly asked, "Jen, can you lend me enough funds to purchase the frozen lunarium immediately? I need it for something, but I won't have enough funds before the auction ends." Jennifer knew that Jason had auctioned multiple things in the auction house in the last 4 months, but what she didn't know was that he would have gathered enough funds to purchase the frozen lunarium after the biannual event. He is auctioning something off in the biannual event, and it gives him enough funds to purchase the frozen lunarium. Staring straight at Jason, Jennifer was both confused and curious, only to ponder about Jason's question for just a few seconds before she nodded her head, ready to answer him. "I can purchase everything in the name of the City Lord. So it shouldn't be a problem to purchase the frozen lunarium. I plan to do that, either way. Just pay her back whenever you can. If you plan to run away, just let me tell you that Luna does not like it when people deceive her." This astonished Jason, and at the same time, the latter part of the sentence that felt like an accusatory warning caused him to frown. However, a moment later, he saw a sly smile on Jennifer's face, which told him that she was teasing him. Jason realized that Jennifer trusted him to some extent because only she could purchase something in the name of the City Lord, making a credit if necessary. Thus, he was thankful for her trust, which made him smile brightly as he replied, "If that's the case, I should thank you. And I want to instant purchase the frozen lunarium. There is no need to wait for the frozen lunarium to reach a much higher price during the auction." With that being said, Jennifer immediately purchased the frozen lunarium, which was taken off the auction and away from the exhibition, attracting the surrounding Eos's and Dever's attention. Their first thought was that the City Lord purchased the frozen lunarium, in order to offend the two affluent families that had been troubling Luna for the last few years. As such, taking away the frozen lunarium that both families required from right under their noses could be considered as delivering a tight slap on their faces. It might enrage the families, but they were too weak to directly offend someone at the Spectre stage, let alone injuring Jennifer before snatching the frozen lunarium from her. Nevertheless, the moment the authorities of both families got to know what happened, they turned furious. Without being able to actively do something against them, they simply decided to create trouble for Jennifer. She was most likely at the auction to purchase more than one good, and being unable to purchase even one more item would mean that she would enrage the city lord. Thus, the two families had just decided to form a temporary alliance against Jennifer in order to deprive her of the goods she wanted to purchase or increase the price she would have to pay, manifold. However, how could they know that the city lord had sent Jennifer to the auction house's event because of a specific reason, and not only because she trusted her disciple? Unbeknownst to the authorities of the two families, Jennifer was completely unbothered after knowingly offending them. Rather than being worried, or oblivious to what she had done, Jennifer was smiling lightly, secretly thanking Jason for giving her a challenge during this year's event of the auction house. She was happy and Jason noticed this, which was extremely confusing. Is she still sane, or did someone hit her on the head? Chapter 660 Counter by Hydesgrain. After she received the frozen lunarium from the manager, Jennifer took Jason to the VVIP lounge of the auction house. Only then did she give Jason the frozen lunarium and spoke in a conspiratorial tone. Because of this purchase, I probably offended the two families I mentioned earlier. So, you owe me a favor now. Even though she wanted to sound serious, in the end, she could only smile, expressing her joy about what had happened. This caused Jason to frown at her, only to notice that a few more people were entering the VVIP lounge. The VVIP lounge they were inside was in fact a huge hall that was separated from the rest of the auction house. In front of Jason was a huge transparent glass wall on the first floor through which he could see everything. It gave him the chance to look at the hundreds of people who were already seated in the lengthy rows of seats on the ground floor. Meanwhile, in the center was a simple stage, which was empty as of now. Behind Jason, there was a bar the newcomers immediately rushed to as he heard them gossip. Do you think the city lord wanted to offend the July and Ori family? After everything they had done to provoke her, it should only be obvious that she delivers a befitting retort. Still, I didn't expect her disciple to nonchalantly instant purchase the item they need. It's not like the two poor to do the same, but the July and Ori family made an agreement to bet for the frozen lunarium to play it fair. This caused Jason to turn around, where he looked at two ears who were having their fun with the situation he seemed to have created. Either way, it was about time for the July and Ori family to get to know what happens if they continue provoking the city lord. I always thought that she was taking them too lightly, ignoring them, which gave them the necessary time to strengthen their connections to the outside world. While the two ears were continuing to talk, Jason could only turn around, to look at Jennifer with doubtful eyes. Was it really okay for her to purchase the frozen lunarium? However, just as he thought that, Jason imagined how it would have been if he'd purchased the frozen lunarium instead of Jennifer. A simple visualization was enough to make him understand that he would have probably been killed and deprived of the frozen lunarium because he would be considered a nobody who had dared to offend not one but two influential families. Don't worry too much. My master ordered me to provoke and offend a few families that wanted to purchase certain items from the beginning. Initially, I wanted to purchase the frozen lunarium later, even if it would have increased the price by a few times. You know, some families still don't understand what they should do in the face of a powerhouse at the Spectre stage, and some are not as oblivious and know their place. Master finally decided to make it clear that she is not to be taken lightly, and that others should be put in their place every once in a while so that they pay attention to how they behave. Jason didn't expect that Luna would do something like this because he knew that the city lord had been silent for decades, ignoring every single provocation that had happened until then. It was exactly because of this information which he had procured while reading books in the Auxiliary Tower's library in addition to eavesdropping on others' conversation that Jason was so confused right now. This made him ask Jennifer straightforwardly. Is there a reason for the city lord to react all of a sudden? I thought all of you have more than enough to do with the special training in the Barren Lands. Jason didn't mention the cadets or the Tritons organization. Instead, he talked around it, though Jennifer still understood it. She pondered for a moment before answering. To put it simply, the reason is that the Devere and Eos race have begun to cross their limits and Master's patience is wearing off. They've started to force Manners to choose one of the two sides, and if someone wants to stay neutral, they're treated harshly by both sides. That's not all, and it wouldn't be enough to make my Master act, but the families and clans of the three races seem to provoke Master more and more. From the way I see it, the situation is not grave yet, but everyone is trying to find out what they're allowed to do in Lanro, and what is too much. However, because the Master doesn't want to give them the chance to find out either, she wants to use the biannual event of the auction house to give everyone a warning. Initially, Jason had felt bad for giving Jennifer and the City Lord a hard time, only because he needed the frozen lunarium, but that had changed now. He was of the opinion that Luna's warning was still relatively light in comparison to what she wanted to show, but that was probably fine. Giving a light warning before the heavy punishment, huh? Jason wondered before Jennifer took out a small book which she handed him. Take a look inside this book. The items that were auctioned off today are listed down. Everything we want to purchase as well as the things we want to bait the other families with is marked down in addition to extra information. A few of our people also wrote down the normal price for all items, in addition to the assumed price at the auction house. This interested Jason a lot, which made him open the thin book. It didn't take him long before he was fully immersed in the heavy information that was written down in the book, and time flew by. He didn't even realize that 2 hours had already passed as his immersion was only increasing with time. The auction was just starting with an appetizer serving, according to Jason, where he wanted to sell off his less unique manuals at the Terra Advanced rank. This was ought to make a small fortune that should end up with an equal sum than he had already accumulated during the last few months. As such, it was a great deal he made there. Every single seat was occupied in the non-VIP area, and the first few items, which were, in fact, Jason's manuals, were quickly auctioned off. Jason, who had been deep in thoughts, only regained his senses when he heard a small commotion in the rows of people in front of him. He had been standing at the glass wall that was tinted on the outside, preventing others from seeing Jason on the other side. Thus, he immediately heard when people began to talk about the 7 manuals that were displayed at the same time, only for the beautiful auctioneer to describe each technique in a detailed manner, highlighting their advantages, what they could do, and their requirements. In the end, Jason knew that the techniques he sold were not overly powerful, but they were different, which made them unique to some extent. Because of that, he wanted to know how many cultivation stones he would receive in exchange for them. They were sold one at a time, but given the fact that all of them were put up for auction at the same time, Jason assumed that the manager was trying to pull everyone interested in a specific field of manual to the one they needed. Thus, the first technique that was auctioned off had become the least attractive, which seemed to be the auction house manager's plan. Even if Jason was not sure what the manager was pulling off, it looked like he was good at his job because the final result after all 7 manuals had been sold was shocking. He really knows what he is doing. That's definitely a good profit margin. Jennifer mumbled, which caused Jason to suddenly cough up as he realized how much he had earned in a matter of a few minutes. I'm not dreaming, right?